stop being a pea potato. It's season 2, everybody. This year, our theme is Lord Teach Us. And we're pretty excited about that. Thanks to a lot of great people. We're going to talk more about Jesus. Thanks for tuning in. We love you, and Jesus loves you.
Everyone has people that have influenced their lives, and I personally have several. With me today are two of those people that I count as two of my closest friends, Tyler Crawford, Blake Edwards. Thanks for coming on with me today.
It's good to be here.
Yeah, man. Really glad we could do this.
You know, I don't normally do this as far as talking about how the podcast is doing generally, but this season has been successful. According to the information we have access to, the podcast has been downloaded in 39 countries and in every state in the United States, with the exception of, and I'm going to call them out, Maine, Vermont, and Wyoming. And I just take the time to say that is that I think it's pretty powerful to see what's happened with this small podcast. It makes you feel good with the world, because all we've talked about this year is Jesus. And people all over the world, they're longing to know him. They're longing for a relationship with him, to the point where they're searching him out and they're listening to other people talk about him. And that, guys, is a beautiful thing. And so today marks the close of season 2, 22 episodes this go around. And with the help of so many folks, we've learned so much about our Lord. But at the end of the day, all we've talked about is Jesus. We want to be more like him. Instead of just starting off with a passage like we traditionally do, I want to start off by reading to you a song. Many of us have heard this song or have sung it many times. It's called the Servant Song. It goes like this: "Make me a servant, just like your son. For he was a servant. Please make me one. Make me a servant, do what you must do. To make me a servant, make me like you. Make me a servant, take all my pride. For I would be lowly, humble inside. Giving to others with all that I do, in love for my brother. Make me like you. Make me a servant filled with your might, and may all my labors shine with your light. Show me your footsteps and what I should do, for now and forever, make me like you." This song, guys, is really powerful, and yet it's super simple. So what I want to do is I want to break this down. We've talked about this before the recording began. I want to break this thing down, and I want to start with the first verse. I'm going to kick it over to whichever guy wants to speak first. The two-part question here: do you think we fully understand what being a servant like Jesus looks like? And just generally speaking, what are y'all seeing here?
Well, this is a song, I mean, whether this is the first time you're listening, this is the first time you've heard it, or if you've heard it before, you've sung it before. I know my experience, I've sung this a lot over the years, and it's something that, just like any song, I feel like I've kind of gotten into this groove where the more you sing it, the more familiar it becomes, and the less it kind of works on you, or it's harder maybe for you to really feel as you're singing it. It just becomes familiar in that way, and this is one of those where I'm really glad we're doing this. It's something that, as you talk about this season, you talk about looking to the Lord to teach us the concept of the servant. This is a servant song, and if you've done any study in the book of Isaiah, you know that the theme of the servant kind of comes to a real climax in the prophecy of Isaiah. And so when you look at this, and it seems really simple, and it's this concept that we want to be a servant and that we want to be like his son in that way. I think at first glance, you think, okay, yeah, I'm going to be a servant. I'm going to serve. Those are good things. But if you think about the trajectory of this idea, this theme of the servant in the whole Bible, look back at the people who are like our biblical heroes. And if there's somebody in the Bible that is significant, usually the greatest thing that can be said about those people, if you think about Moses, God says that there's no servant in my house like my servant Moses. And if you think about David later on, and these are the guys, these are the heroes. And David, that he says, he'll say to God himself that he says, "Who am I that you would look upon me with favor? I am, your servant." And that's how David saw himself. And so when Isaiah comes along and has this unnamed servant, and you can read about it, and the servant songs that I referenced earlier, just you should go read them yourself. And in chapter 42, 49 of Isaiah, 50, and then 51, and and then 52, the end of 52, and then 53 is the one that most of us know. Just the idea of this servant being somebody, the conduit through which God can do what he wants to do in this world through a human. It's just such a powerful concept. And I just appreciate in this song those words that we're asking God to just let us be his servant. Let us learn from him, and let us just be used by him for whatever his purpose is.
Yeah, as far as do we understand what this means, or do we understand what this looks like? I think we do to some degree. Like we get the concept of it. You can't actually look at the teaching of Jesus and not understand that he was a servant. I mean, one of the first passages that came to my mind is in Mark 10 and verse 45, after there's a discussion among the disciples about who's the greatest or who's going to be the greatest. He just says, the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. So it seems like to me, if you believe that Jesus gave his life as a ransom for many, then you understand the concept of him being a servant. So we understand that to some degree. Now, I've understood that for a long time, but it's not like I actually understood what that meant for me. But part of the song is a prayer, and we're asking God to make us a servant like Jesus. So the gravity of that and how big that is, and all the different ways that we're actually trying to be like Jesus as a servant. Yeah, I don't think we think about that as much. I'll say this: I don't think I have understood that the way I should. But the big picture idea, as far as just Jesus being a servant, I think most people understand that, and because we see that most of all through the cross, we understand servanthood and service. But how that looks every day for us, that's the challenging part, to nail that down and to really apply that, I think.
Let's look back at the first part of the second verse again. And I'm going to read it. It says, "Make me a servant, take all of my pride, for I would be lowly and humble inside." On the surface, this sounds really simple. If I'm going to confess, this is a little bit challenging for me to sing if I'm really thinking about what I'm saying. I feel that I'm humble. I think that I am. But if I'm honest, I battle with pride. Guys, any thoughts on how we can look to Jesus as an example here?
So I'll tell you the scripture that came to my mind when reading that verse, and it's Philippians 2. So at the beginning of Philippians 2, Paul says in verse 4, "Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others." And then he says, "Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. Being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross." So when I hear that verse, when I sing that verse about take all my pride, I would be lowly, humble inside, that's really asking us to be more like Jesus. And the first thing that stands out to me about Philippians 2 is the fact that he emptied himself. And what we're asking God to do, and what we're wanting for God to do with us and in our life, is to first empty ourselves, like to take all of our pride, to take all the things that we value most about ourselves in some way, and just like empty that in order to be like Jesus, to be a servant. And that is really hard. I mean, because we all have certain things that we're prideful about. We have our own desires, our passions. We have the things that we think are really important. And our society values a lot of things that maybe we have to empty ourselves of in order to ever be like Jesus as a servant. It's not just about doing the things. It's not like I can just start doing things and that's all it takes.
Yeah.
First, there has to be like an emptying in order to be filled up like Jesus. And so that's the first thing that came to my mind, at least.
Yeah, that passage in Philippians is just such a powerful one. It's something I come back to all the time. Like you're saying, Josh, just trying to have some sort of barometer just to check myself, because the funny thing about humility is if you start thinking and trying to check yourself on that, sometimes you kid yourself and think, well, it would be proud for me to even, start to do any kind of self-assessment. You start self-deprecating, or you can go the other way and think too much of yourself. And so I think the idea of our having a proper sense of self-worth is something that can be so challenging. And in both directions, we can think too little of ourselves, actually.
Yeah.
But we can also, so a lot of times we think the pride part. It's obvious when we think too much of ourselves, and that's something I think we all struggle with. But the really great thing about just looking to Jesus and the pattern that he lays out for us as this, again, this idea of being the Lord's servant. If you look in Isaiah, just one of the things I think about is it's this unexpected twist in the story is that the servant, when he's introduced, it's clearly there's things that are being said that make you realize we're talking about the Messiah. And in Isaiah 52, this is the part of this kind of larger section, this servant song that we often miss. I think a lot of times we go straight to Isaiah 53, the suffering servant, but we don't see where that begins. And in Isaiah 52, behold, in verse 13, my servant shall act wisely. He shall be high and lifted up and be exalted. Those terms, high and lifted up, are ones that were previously only used to describe God himself when Isaiah sees him on his throne. And so what's really amazing is that it turns there and begins immediately talking about his appearance being marred. And that as we know in 53, he's going to be rejected and he's going to suffer. It's on the account of others that he's doing that. And it's because he trusts God. We know, talking about Jesus, he trusts God, his Father, and his plan. And so it's actually in that he finds his value, that he finds his sense of self-worth. And so practically speaking for us, the remarkable and amazing thing is that even if we suffer, and even if things don't always go our way, the things we can't control here on this earth, that if we'll simply put our trust in our Father and we'll simply seek only to do to humbly just accept his will and know that I have some small part to play for his grand purpose, then that has the power to really actually be the thing that glorifies me, that gives me whatever value, whatever I am. It's all God, and it's all because he has given me purpose as his servant.
Man, that's so good. Let's pick up with the second verse, the second part of that, where it says, giving to others with all that I do in love for my brother, make me like you. The question I have from that, guys, is what are we fully asking here?
I think what we're asking is we're asking for God to help reshape and redefine what we view our whole purpose being. I mean, if the first part is about emptying ourselves and humbling ourselves, the second part of that verse is now everything I do, I want it to be how I can serve. I want it to be focused on how I can serve other people. I want my motivation to be not love of self, not love of things, not anything like that. I want it to be love of my brother. And we see that's what Jesus did. And so the fact that he did not do things that pleased himself. He only did things that pleased the Father, and only did things that showed love for people he came to save. That's the refilling. Like if you think about some sort of, any type of glass or anything like that, if you want something new inside, first you have to empty what's already there. And now this is the filling back up of the glass. This is us filling back up ourselves again with the things that we know are important, because we see Jesus and we see that's what he did. And if the Son of God can do that, the creator of all things can do that, then however high we think of ourselves, we empty ourselves of that. However great we think we are, empty ourselves of that. And then instead of filling ourselves back up with those same things, we fill ourselves up with things like service and giving and love, not of self and not for ourselves, but for others. And I think that's like the day-to-day, what are we going to do? And if the first thing we think of is, well, I got to do what I got to do, well, then we haven't truly emptied ourselves. But if part of the first things we think of is like, hey, what can I do for others today? Who do I need to reach out to today? What does sister so-and-so need? What does, brother so-and-so, or just what does my neighbor need today? Which, by the way, I'm not saying I do that all the time, but if we're doing that, that's probably showing that this is what we've taken on the mind of Christ in a way that really is counterculture, in a way that is counter to what some of us have been brought up to think and do.
I love that.
Yeah, that's such a powerful thing what Blake's saying, and it really is a continuation of what we've been talking about to this point. And I would just say to those listening out there, if you feel at times just stuck, that if you feel unfulfilled, that you're doing things in life and you never really seem satisfied, it never seems to give you a sense of fulfillment like you thought it would. And this can be anything. It can be in relationships. It can be in your job. So much in this life that we're the pursuits that we have, they're all about us, and they always end in the same spot. And we always feel like we're just chasing our tail and going in circles. And so if you find yourself having ever experienced that, and I think if I'm talking to human beings right now, we can all say we have, then try what Blake just said and what we're talking about, that this song is exemplifying, and what we're talking about in terms of just the biblical concept of the servant. Try making your life all about service to others and just watch the results. Because again, if you want to have fulfillment, if you want to find purpose and meaning and value, that's what Jesus taught us. He showed us the way. He did it, as Blake's already said. It culminated in the cross, in that moment where he trusted God to say, I'm not going to do it with shortcuts like Satan offered him in the wilderness. I'm not going to let Satan, hand me power in the way that the world does. And instead, I'm going to trust my Father. And if it means that I suffer along the way until God fully accomplishes his purpose, then I'm willing to do it. And I'm going to serve others and make that what my existence is all about. And that's, what Blake already said. I came not to be served as your king. I came not to be served, but to serve. And what a powerful thing. And so I just think it's something so practical for us to just make our lives, as Blake said, every morning, wake up and think, how am I going to serve someone else? How am I going to make this day be about everyone else except for me?
Guys, everything you said so far are really powerful. Let's look at the last verse here. And this is the first part of it. Make me a servant filled by your might, and may all my labors shine with your light. Two-part question. How can we be filled with Jesus' might? That's the first part of the question. Second part, and are we saying our labor, what we're doing on earth, can possibly align with him? Is that what we're saying with this verse?
That I think we're going to, at times in our life, almost, I feel like, cyclically speaking, we're going to be frustrated, because we're going to find that once we realize that there is a standard and there is a human who did things how humans are supposed to do, And once we start looking to that standard, we're going to continue to be frustrated because there's going to be so many times that we realize that we've come up, woefully short. But the really cool thing about the way that this servant kind of theme, kind of tracing it through Isaiah, but then on to culmination in Jesus, is that the work that he accomplishes through suffering in chapter 53, to that point, and you've probably heard this before if you've ever done a survey of Isaiah or studied it, to that point, it's all been just about the servant. And at times it's talking about Israel as God's servant and their failure to be God's servant. And then at other times it's talking about the capital S servant who we see in Jesus himself. But in chapter 54 is the first time that you get not a singular servant, but the plural form. And in verse 17 of chapter 54, no weapon that is fashioned against you shall succeed. You shall refute every tongue that rises against you in judgment. This is the heritage of the servants of the Lord, and their vindication from me, declares the Lord. So the culmination of all of this, the plan, it was always for God to have his kingdom of servants, to use the work of that perfect servant, the one who did fully submit, and to take on the strength that he found in that God gave him when he submitted to him. You see, no weapon that's fashioned against us will stand. We can be what we're supposed to be if we'll just submit to him. And we can do that because of the work of the servant.
I'm not sure if I've thought about it in this way, but I don't think that we see Jesus in the Gospels portrayed as someone that had an identity crisis, like,
Yeah.
if you think about what Tyler's bringing up from Isaiah, Jesus was meant to represent the servant and the king and this Messiah at the same time. It's not like half of his life was one thing and half of his life was another. And that's kind of a complex thing, that these character traits would all be intertwined. And the fact that he did that kind of shows us that it's not like he had this issue within himself of, oh, I don't really want to do this or that. We do see that he was not really looking forward to going to the cross, of course, but I don't think that's an identity crisis. I think that's just, he didn't want to go through all of this. He didn't want to go through the pain and the suffering, because that was the humanity, part that just, he didn't want to go through that. But it's not like he was unwilling to serve because he thought he was deserving of being a king necessarily, right? And that's what we have a problem with, I think, is that we think sometimes so highly of ourselves that we're unwilling to serve. And then as soon as we humble ourselves and we take on the attitude of the servant that we see Tyler's been talking about from Isaiah, one of the things that sometimes we might miss is that in order to be that servant, we need to be filled with the strength and might that Jesus was filled with. And one of the cool things that I think of is actually in Colossians 1. Paul is telling these Christians what his prayer is for them, and he wants them to be filled with the knowledge of God's will, and that way they can walk in a way that pleases God, and they can bear fruit. And then he says, being strengthened with all power according to his glorious might, for all endurance and patience with joy. So the thing that is going to help them, the thing that is going to support them as they try to just do God's will and to bear fruit and serve each other and serve others and live a life of love for other people, is not their own strength, but actually the strength and the might of Jesus. That's going to be what lifts them up. That's going to be the thing that pushes them and gives everything that they do. It's going to give them the energy they need to do all that they do. And I don't think that's something I pray for. That's not something that I think about as much. I think about, all right, time to do this. Let's just go. And I try to pump myself up for doing things and try to motivate myself. And really, I should be looking to God. I should be looking to Jesus as it's his strength and it's his might that's going to help me to bear fruit, help me to please him, help me to serve. And if you kind of go the path that Tyler's been taking of going back and looking at Isaiah, just think about the identity of this coming servant and how intricate that is, and how he's not just a servant, he's also this Messiah and everything like that. And wow, how is he able to do that and not have some sort of issue within himself? Well, he did it. And if we look to him, then we're going to be able to accomplish things on this earth that God has set out for us to accomplish.
I think it's what you just said is pretty awesome, that we must rely on Jesus. I think that's pretty comforting to get where we want to be. The last part of the song here, it says, "Show me your footsteps and what I should do, for now and forever, make me like you." Guys, in thinking about how to be like Jesus, the natural question one would have is, how do we know what to do in order to be more like Jesus?
So I think within that verse, within that one line, maybe is the key that I don't know if I've thought about until right now. And that's where he says, "Show me your footsteps." And there's a passage, obviously, in Philippians. There's also a passage in First Peter that talks about a similar thing. I've always appreciated both of these scriptures because what they paint a picture of is looking at the footsteps of Jesus and trying to walk in his footsteps. And I just love that image, because what it does is it helps us see the path that Jesus walked, and it helps us to have confidence that I can take those same steps, and that's the right step to take, that's the path to take. So the fact that in the song we're saying, "Show me your footsteps and what I should do," we're not saying, "Show me my own footsteps."
Yeah.
We're saying we just want to see how Jesus walked already, and we want to walk in that way. And that again is counter to a lot of things that we have deep within us as far as what we want to do. We want to make our name great sometimes. We want to be recognized for the things we do. And instead, we actually are saying we just want to look more like Jesus and follow his path. Now, part of that, with the first part of this third verse, is we want our labors to shine with his light. So we do want the things we do to be seen. We want acts of service and the way we show love. We want that to be seen, but not by men. We want it to be seen by God. We want to shine his light. We want to walk in his footsteps. So that way, all the things that we do, it's not that we're seeking glory for ourselves. We're seeking just to walk in the footsteps of Jesus. And in that, from some of the verses we've already read, we know there is glory in that. And that's a hard thing, is to be satisfied with the glory that comes by just walking in the path of Jesus, and not by making our own path and seeking glory in that way.
Yeah. So to this point, it's all been, at least for me, going back and looking at the pattern that we get of this servant using Isaiah. But in terms of, I think we've all been kind of hitting at this, like, how does that come forward to us? Like, what's the relevance of kind of this standard that we see in the servant? How is it just, was it, is all of that written just so that we can understand who Jesus is? Or was it also written so we can understand who we are? And the really cool thing that you get in the New Testament is actually Paul himself in Acts chapter 13. I don't have it in front of me to read, but he and Barnabas, when they're talking, they actually quote from one of the servant songs and say, this is what's been given to us to do, to preach to the Gentiles, to bring those who are in darkness out into God's light. And so what's really cool is, as Blake said, Jesus knew precisely who he was, his identity. He knew that his whole identity was shaped as he looked at that he was loved by his Father and that he was going to do his Father's will. And as we talk about walking in his footsteps, Paul, that's exactly what became everything in his life. That's how he now saw himself. It wasn't about his credentials anymore. It wasn't about his pursuits to be the best Jew that's ever been. It was all about Jesus, and that to him was following in his footsteps. And I really love Peter's example, and it specifically mentions following here in 1 Peter chapter 2. And it's actually a bit of a quote. If you kind of start to read it, he's pulling language straight from Isaiah 53, because he's talking to people that he knows are going to suffer. And he knows that when they suffer, they're going to be scratching their heads thinking, is this really God's plan? Like, is this really his gracious work that he's planned to do in this world? And oftentimes when we look around and we see it's 2020, and I don't know about you guys, but sometimes I'm looking around and I'm saying, what, there's just so much that's gone wrong, and you're scratching your head. But I think what Peter is speaking to the people he's talking to, and I think he's talking directly to us, is to say that when we suffer, know that it is still God's grace, and know that he still can accomplish his work through you. And so in verse 19, for this is a gracious thing when, mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. For what credit is it when you sin and are beaten if you endure? But if when you do good and suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in his steps. And then he goes on, and like I said, continue reading that passage, and you realize he's thinking of Isaiah 53 and what Jesus had done. And what I love about this, the fact that it comes from Peter, is that think about the fact that Peter was the one who was there when Jesus was trying to explain his purpose. Once Peter has just identified him and said, you are the Messiah, you are the Christ, you are the King. When he finally recognizes and identifies Jesus as that King, the first thing Jesus says is, okay, you're right. I'm going to now go to Jerusalem, but not in the way you think, not to go and accept my throne and to be crowned, but to go to suffer and to die. And you may remember that Peter is not too happy about that plan. And it almost, you can just see it blows his mind. He's like, no, you're the King. Didn't you hear what I just said? I said, you're the King. This is not your plan. You're not going to suffer. And so to see how this changes Peter, to see how the cross gives this new perspective, and it can change someone like Peter, who was ready to fight. And all of a sudden now he's saying, you know what? When your enemies come against you, respond with a blessing. Don't curse in response. That's not God's plan. And, that's tough, but we live in a world right now that seems like it's ready to just, it doesn't matter what the issue is. If we're talking about masks, if we're talking about, politics, the issues of racial injustice, there's so much that people want to just divide and take sides and go to war. And how powerful it is to think that there is a better way, and that we can follow in the footsteps of the servant and be servants of God.
Amen. It makes me think of meekness and how Jesus exemplifies meekness, where you have the ability and the power, but you restrain it. And I think that's what we see from 1 Peter 2 I think that's what we see from 1 Peter 2 that Tyler was just referencing when it comes to following in the footsteps, is that it's not that we can't do other things. It's not that we can't make our own path, or it's not that we don't have the strength and ability and power to do whatever we want in some way. It's that we restrain ourselves. So we keep that in check, and we choose to humble ourselves and try to follow that pattern of Jesus. It's not easy to stop yourself from doing what you think is best for yourself or your family, and rather to do what's best in the kingdom. It's not easy to stop yourself from playing the comparison game as servants and be like, well, but so-and-so is getting a little bit more shine, a little bit more attention. Well, I'm not going to care about that. I'm just going to keep serving. And that's really hard sometimes. But if we do that, if we just really show meekness and humility empty ourselves, fill ourselves up with what God wants us to be doing, and we continue to serve and we continue to show that endurance because we're strengthened by the Lord himself and we're taking on the attitude and mindset of Jesus, then that's all the glory and shine that we could ever hope for, because God is looking down and seeing us look like his son.
Well, brothers, that was awesome. I think selfishly, I probably enjoyed that. I'm not going to say more than others, but just being so close to you guys, that was great.
This one was for Delaware and for Wyoming.
Oh, that's so funny. Oh man, yeah, 3 states away from completing the U.S. Maybe we'll get some love there from this episode. I think I can say this on the behalf of the 3 of us. We really, truly pray that this was helpful for anyone who's listening. We all want to be more like Jesus, and we hope that this episode just gets you closer in that direction. Guys, thanks so much for your time today, and truly, it's an honor to be your friend.
Man, love you guys a lot, and thanks so much for what you're doing, Josh. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, same here. Love you guys.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. Please review, subscribe, give us a like on Facebook. Have a great day. God bless.
Stop being a cute potato. 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 Stop being a cute potato.